who is our rock and our Redeemer, and who is the source of truth and grace in our lives. Amen. So about 15 years ago, after a worship service on a Sunday morning, a young man came up to speak with me. I estimated he was somewhere in his late 20s. And he introduced himself and said his name was Matt, and he asked if he could set up an appointment to come see me in my office that week. And of course, I said sure, and we set up a time where we could get together. When he came in my office, he told me his story. Matt had been raised in a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod congregation, maybe a different kind of building and a little older congregation than this one, but very similar kind of size congregation and a lot of similarities. Matt, when he was growing up, they had a Christian day school there, so he went to their Christian day school as well. Religion was always his favorite subject, and when it came time for confirmation in 8th grade, Matt's pastor had a little tradition that he would do where he would pick one student from the class to help him write the sermon for the confirmation service, and then that student would actually read the sermon in the confirmation service on that Sunday when they were confirmed. And Matt was the one that his pastor chose to do that. In high school, when Matt's friends were out late on Saturday nights drinking and sleeping in on Sunday morning, Matt was faithfully coming to church with his parents every Sunday, and in fact started teaching Sunday school when he was in junior high still, and by his junior in high school, he was the 4th grade Sunday school teacher there at their church. And so Matt, very, very involved. His pastor had even talked with him a few times about, Matt, do you think maybe when you're older, God might be calling you to be a pastor? But there was something else going on in Matt's life too, he shared with me, and that was as his friends, when they started to reach puberty, when his friends started talking fondly about the girls in the class, Matt realized he didn't feel that same way about the girls in the class. In fact, he felt that way about some of the guys in the class. And Matt told me for many years he had prayed to God to change how he felt. But finally, he just came to the realization that that wasn't going to change and that he was gay. And so he shared with me, this is again junior year in high school, he was 17 years old. Finally, one Sunday, he decided he needed to talk to his parents. And so he sat his mom and dad down on a Sunday evening, and he shared with them that he was gay. And that conversation went incredibly better than he expected. His parents were understanding, they were loving, they were accepting, and so buoyed kind of by how well that conversation went, Matt set up an appointment to talk with his pastor that Tuesday night. And he shared his story with his pastor, much like he had shared it with his parents and much like he had shared it with me that day, he said. And when he got done, it was kind of dead silence in the room. And Matt told me he felt like it was just like 20 minutes. He said, I know it was probably 20 seconds. But he said the silence just dragged on. And he said, and then finally, my pastor, who I had known, he'd baptized me, I'd known him my whole life, he looked at me and he said, well, Matt, I want you to know you're still welcome in church on Sunday. Now, Matt said that just floored him, because it had never even occurred to him that he might not be welcome in church on Sunday. And then the pastor went on to say this. He said, but Matt, you can't teach Sunday school anymore, and we'll find somebody to cover your Sunday school class this week. And he said, and I really need to think and pray about whether you should come to communion or not. So if you would just please don't come to communion on Sunday. Matt said he left his pastor's office that night just with his heart in his feet. Now, I want to pause Matt's story for just a minute here, just to give you a little qualification. I'm not here to criticize Matt's pastor tonight, and I'm not trying to make Matt's pastor sound like a bad guy or anything like that. I think Matt's pastor was truly trying to be faithful to what he believed he had been taught over the years, and I think he was just woefully unprepared for this kind of conversation, right? So back to Matt's story, it gets worse. That was on Tuesday night, remember? Well, on Thursday night, Matt's at home, and he told me the phone rang. And this was when there was still, the one phone in the kitchen with the long cord that was constantly getting tangled, right? And so the phone rang, and Matt's mom was near, so she grabbed it. She said, "Matt, it's Pastor. He wants to talk to you." So he hadn't told his parents how poorly that conversation had gone, at least from his perspective. And so he got the phone, and he said he went down as far down the hallway he could so his parents wouldn't hear the conversation. And his pastor told him this. He said, "Well, Matt, I want you to know I called an emergency elders meeting tonight about your situation. And the elders agree with me that you can't teach Sunday school anymore. But they've left it up to me as to whether you take communion, and I'm still thinking and praying about that, so I'd appreciate it if you didn't come up for communion with your family this Sunday." So imagine what it was like for Matt showing up for church that Sunday morning. First of all, he hadn't taught his Sunday school class before church like he normally would have. And now as he's walking into church with his family, every elder in the church is staring at him. Every elder's wife in the church is staring at him. And then he said when it came time for communion and his whole family went up for communion and he obediently stayed sitting in the pew, he said now everybody in church was staring at him. And he told me that in that moment he got up and he walked out, and he had never been back to a church until that previous Sunday when he had showed up at our congregation. See, I believe we can do a lot better job as pastors and as churches, church families, and as individual Christians when it comes to showing God's love and grace to the people that God puts in our lives who are from what we would call the LGBTQ community. Now, there's a number of different ways to kind of talk about this issue, right? One of them would be to say, well, what does the Bible say about this, right? I'll be honest with you. One of the questions I get asked the most often by people who want to visit a church, and by the way, it's happened here at King of Glory. This wasn't just something that happened to me at Trinity, but since I've been here at King of Glory, I think it's probably been half a dozen times that I've got a phone call or an email from someone saying, "I'm thinking about visiting your church." And the first question is, "Do you believe being gay is a sin?" Now, by the way, I don't answer that question. I say, well, why is that important to you? Because 9 times out of 10, people aren't really asking that question. They don't really care what we believe theologically. You'll see some statistics on that in a little bit. What they are asking is, how are you going to treat me if I come to your church? Or how are you going to treat my friend if she comes with me to church? That's what they really want to know. And so, but one way we could talk about that issue tonight would be to open up God's Word and look at the 6 Bible passages everybody points to and discuss that. But that's not my purpose with you tonight. That's not why I'm here. Another way to talk about this would say, well, what does the society around us need to hear when it comes to issues of sexuality? I think we would all agree that we see a society that is moving further and further from God's plan for our lives in so many different areas, right? And so there's this question, well, what does the society around us need to hear? And that's an important question, but that's not the reason I'm here to talk with you guys tonight. That's not the most important question. The reason I'm here to talk with you tonight is, as I've already kind of indicated, I want to help you just as individual Christians think about how can you do a better job, or what kind of conversations should you be having with people, again, that God may bring into your life who would be gay or trans, or there's other possibilities there too. Or how could we as King of Glory Lutheran Church, or we as a church family, do a better job with this issue as well? That's what I want to talk with you about tonight as well. And by the way, I would urge you to not let especially the political question get in the way of what we're talking about tonight. Because one of the things I found is over the last 6-8 years, politics have become so much more in the forefront, especially when it comes to the transgender issue, but with gay marriage as well. And it can become so easy to let our politics affect our theology, or even more important, our Christian walk. And I want to just urge us to be careful not to let that happen, okay? And by the way, if I think it's happening, I'm going to call us on it. I'm going to say, wait a minute. I think we're starting to let politics get involved here, okay? So, first of all, again, I asked this question a little on Sunday, but how many of you know someone who would say they are part of the LGBTQ community? Yeah. Let me make it a little more personal. How many of you may have someone in your family? Yeah, a lot of us do, right? You can tell that's me on the left. You guys may remember or may know my sister. She's the one in the front. She's the one taking the selfie. We always let Carolyn take the selfies because she's much better at it than I am, right? If I did it, you would see all three of my chins, but she's good at kind of getting it in position so you don't see that, right? And next to my sister is my brother Paul. And next to my brother Paul is Paul's husband, Jim. Now, I got to tell you, sometimes when I say that, at churches, or I was speaking at a theological conference up in Michigan, and when I said that, there were audible gasps in the room. That ought to tell us something, right? But the reason I think this is so important for us is because whether it's because of changes in what's happening in the world around us, or whether it's because people are just more open about what they're going through, it seems like we are more and more and more encountering and getting to know and getting to be friends with people from the LGBTQ community. And again, I think sometimes we as Christians are poorly prepared for that. And there's a lot of reasons why that may be the case. But our job tonight is to get better at that and to ask some really important questions about that. And so, by the way, here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to talk for a little while more. Then we're going to take just a little break. And then after that break, I'm going to talk about a few principles that I think we ought to have in mind. And then we're going to do some interaction, some Q&A and things like that. And by the way, sometimes I find out some of those questions and interactions are where some of the most important stuff gets talked about too, right? So first of all, I want to try one more thing with you right now. I'm going to recommend some books or things for you to read. You don't have to write these down. I've actually got a sheet of paper that is all written down on if you want to do any follow-up, and you can come up and get one of these later. But this is a guy by the name of Justin Lee. Justin Lee, his book Torn is probably the best book I've ever read of helping you understand what it might be like to be gay and grow up in a pretty strongly conservative Christian church family. He describes in detail what that was like for him, right? But Justin Lee was speaking at a conference I was at once, and he did something that really was fundamental for me in helping me think through this issue, okay? And here's what he did. I want to try it with you, okay? I want you to close your eyes for me for a minute, if you would, okay? And now I want you to imagine that right now there was this booming voice from heaven. Clearly it was God. And God said, glad you guys are all together tonight. I'm announcing this to all Christians all over the world. As of this moment, Christian marriage no longer exists. I've decided that marriage does not exist for Christians. If you're married, you're not married anymore. Your marriage is dissolved. If you have kids, don't worry. We're going to get somebody else to take care of your kids. That you are now alone. People in the rest of the world can get married if they want, but not you. You're Christians. Marriage is over for you. Okay? Oh, think about that for a minute. What questions would you have for God? What would your concerns be? All right, you can open your eyes. But what if God decided to do away with Christian marriage? And at the conference I was at, Justin Lee did with all of us what I just did with you. And then he did this. He said, all right, now how many of you, when I ask you what questions or concerns do you have, was your first thought, who am I going to have sex with? That was probably not your first thought, right? May not have been your second or third. It may have been on the list somewhere. But his point was this. He said, for heterosexual Christians, when we talk about LGBTQ issues, for us, the first thing we want to go to or talk about or think about is sex. And he goes, but for people who are gay or trans or bisexual or asexual, for them, this is a much, much bigger issue than that. It's who's going to take care of me when I'm sick. It's who am I going to binge watch Netflix with? It's who's going to, help me figure out stuff that I'm not good at? Who's going to cook for me? Those kinds of questions and issues, right? And so what he was trying to do at that conference as a gay man was trying to help us, those of us who are straight or cisgender, to understand that for gay or trans people, talking about what God has to say about this issue and how we're going to be treated by the church and things like that is about so much more than simply sex. It's about relationship. And when some Christians say to someone who is gay, well, God's plan for you is that you be single and celibate for your whole life, we're not thinking about the high bar we've set for people. And so with that in mind, I have some really good news for you tonight, okay? This is a guy by the name of Andrew Marin. Andrew actually grew up in Naperville, Illinois, so not that far from here. Andrew has a kind of a unique story. When he went away to college for the first time, he was put with 3 random roommates who he had never met before in one of those quad rooms, where you each have your own bedroom, but you share a common space and bathroom, stuff like that. And during his freshman year, all 3 of his roommates came out as gay. And he started looking in the mirror going, I don't think I'm gay, but I don't know, I'm not sure what's going on here, right? But the conversations he had and the friendships that he had made, Andrew also grew up a very devout, conservative Christian who had been told pretty clearly all his life that being gay was not God's plan for your life, right? And so Andrew had to try to wrestle through that a little bit, and it led him to start a ministry called the Marin Foundation for the sole purpose of helping Christians and LGBTQ people get to know each other and talk and build relationships together. Well, he's written a book called Us Versus Us, and it's a summary of the research that he did on people in the LGBTQ community, and here's what he found. I'm going to give you some numbers for this in a minute, but just in general, here's what he found. He uses the acronym LGBT, by the way, so that's why I've used it here. I'm just quoting him. But he said most LGBT people regularly attended a faith community for the majority of their youth. So most people that you talk to from the LGBTQ community grew up in a faith community. Most of them, 96% by the way, left the church after they came out. Their story's a lot like Matt's story. Most still believe in God and are interested in one day finding a faith community. In other words, they want to go back to church, they're just not sure how they'd be treated if they did. And then finally, and this one I think is really important, most are less concerned with the church's theology of homosexuality than they are with how they are treated by individual Christians at a church. In other words, so they're not really that concerned about what it says on your church website about this subject. They are concerned about how they're being treated by people, day to day as a part of the church. Here's some numbers for this. 86% of LGBT people were raised in a faith community, he found in his study. The general population right now is 75%. So that means a higher percentage of LGBT people grew up in church than the general population right now. Here's the one that I really want to make sure you're listening to. 76% of LGBT people are open to returning to the faith and its practices. The general population is 9%. So let me just kind of put that in some other terms. If you walk up to somebody, random stranger on the street, and you say, can I ask you a couple questions? And they say, yeah. And you say, did you grow up in church? And they say, yeah. Do you go to church now? No. Would you like to go back to church? If they're straight, 1 out of 10 would say yes. If they're gay or trans, 3 out of 4 would say yes. There's a spiritual hunger in people in the LGBTQ community, at least according to Marin's study and what he found. And I can tell you, according to my conversations I've had with LGBTQ people over the years. Some of them even put it this way, that there was a longing to return to the faith of their childhood. So it wasn't just, I would like to go to a church, I would like to go to the church I grew up in, or at least the church body that I was a part of growing up. The problem is they just don't feel like they would be welcome. And that's sad. Here's a quote from Marin's book that I think is really important. The problem is never what you believe. The problem is how you do 2 things. how you communicate what you believe, and how you live out or don't live out what you say that you believe. I think that's really important for us to keep in mind. So what do we believe? Not about the LGBTQ community specifically, but what do we just believe in general? Let's make sure we remember, here's what we believe. We believe that the basis of Christianity is this, that all of us have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. I saw an interview that was done with Pastor Tim Keller once. Have you guys heard of Pastor Tim Keller? He unfortunately has passed away, but he was a pastor in the city of New York. Came from the Episcopal background, but you read his books, he quotes Martin Luther more than most Lutherans do, right? And Tim Keller just was a pastor of a growing, thriving church. He's a great theological mind. He's really good at communicating the faith to people who didn't grow up in the church and don't really understand religious things. I saw him, he was being interviewed at this conference once, and this was not a religious conference. This was secular. It was a secular guy interviewing him. And he said to him, he was asking him different theological questions. Do you believe, that people have to believe in Jesus to go to heaven? Those kinds of questions. And he finally said to him, he said, do you believe LGBTQ people are going to hell? And he said, no, and I don't believe straight people are going to heaven either. And then he talked about that a little bit. He said, sometimes we give the impression that gay people are sinners and straight people aren't. And he said, that's just not true, and that's not what we believe as Christians. What we believe as Christians is all of us are sinners. All of us have fallen short of the glory of God, but there's good news, and we are all freely justified by God's grace as a gift. So it isn't that, that some of us need more of that grace than others, or some of us need that grace differently than others. We all need that grace completely. That's what we believe. I say it this way all the time. I have 3 kinds of sin in my life. I have sin that I know is sin, and that through the power of the Holy Spirit, I've achieved a certain level of victory over. I don't do those things anymore. I have sin in my life that I know is sin and I struggle with. I had a seminary professor that used to say, Christians sin, they just do it with tears in their eyes, right? I have some things that I confess. You guys, I stand up there behind that altar, and the elder comes up to give me communion, and while they're coming up, I'm thinking through those things that I'm confessing before God. And I fully intend to never have to confess those things again, but guess what? A week later, I'm right back up there confessing the same sins, right? But I also have a third kind of sin in my life that I don't even know or realize is sin. And God does not say, well, because you've never confessed that sin, you can't go to heaven, right? I have a friend who's a Baptist pastor, and he is convinced every time I have a beer, I'm sinning. Now, I think he's wrong, right? But seriously, he actually talked to me about it once. And he was concerned for me. And I shared with him that I didn't think that was a problem in my life. I said, I have plenty of problems. I don't think that's one of them. He is convinced when we get to heaven, I'm going to look at him and go, oh my gosh, you were right. Thank you for caring about me. Thank God that he forgives me, right? I'm convinced he's going to look at me and he's going to say, man, I missed a lot of fun times with you over the years, right? So we all struggle with sin in our lives. So here are the 2, I believe, most important questions that we need to be thinking about tonight. The first question is, what would Jesus do? If Jesus were here today, if he were walking on the streets of Chicago or Elgin, what would he do? How would he relate with people who are gay or trans? And the second question is, and by the way, I can't tell you for sure that we know the answer to that question because we don't see Jesus doing that in the Gospels at all. But there's a lot we do know about Jesus that I think could help us come to a pretty good answer for what that question would be. What would Jesus do? But then the second question, and this is an important question for all of us, but it's a question that I believe we need to be asking and helping people we know that are gay or trans think through in their lives is, where will you find your identity? Okay, so let's start with that first one. What would Jesus do? Well, in John chapter 1, we're told this about Jesus. It says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. I love the Message translation here. It says, the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. I love that. He dwelt among us. The word here, by the way, is the word tabernacle. It's the same word for that tent of meeting that they set up in the Old Testament where the glory of God would descend upon it and stay there till they were ready to leave, and then it would rise and lead them through the wilderness. That tabernacle where Jesus would come, or where God would come and dwell among them, that's the word here. The word became flesh and tabernacled among us, dwelt among us. It says, and we have seen his glory. Glory is the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. That's verse 14. And then 2 verses later in verse 16, he says this, from his fullness, Jesus' fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. Now, you may have heard that verse before, but I wonder if you ever really thought about that phrase, grace upon grace. What does that mean that John says, from the fullness of Jesus, we've all received grace upon grace? Literally, by the way, the Greek says grace instead of grace, which is really interesting. So what does that mean? Well, when I was growing up, we had an Aunt Diane. Now, she wasn't really my aunt. She wasn't my mom's sister, but she was my mom's best friend. And so we called her Aunt Diane. And she was from Norway, and she had this Norwegian phrase she used to say. I can't even remember it. I couldn't pronounce it at the time. But she said it meant sweetness on top of sweetness. So if something was really, really good, it was this, right? It was sweetness on top of sweetness. It was like a brownie with ice cream on it, with chocolate fudge on top, with whipped cream on top, with a cherry on top. You get the idea, right? It's kind of sweetness on top. That's what I think of when I think about this phrase, grace upon grace. One Bible commentary, by the way, if you don't know what a commentary is, it's the books that pastors read so they look smart in front of people, right? Because they can go read what these other pastors and theologians said about something and learn, right? But one commentary, one favorites is the New International Commentary of the New Testament. Says it this way. Grace upon grace, they say, is grace that is limitless. That it was if it was taken away, instantly be replaced by more grace. I love this line. Grace is always an adventure. No one can say where it will lead, what blessing it will bring, or what challenge it will make. Basically, I think what it's saying here is if we are going to be people that are full of grace upon grace like Jesus was, it's going to be an adventure. And sometimes it's going to lead us in places we never would have expected to be. And it's going to bring some amazing blessings that we never expected, but can also bring some challenges if we are going to be people of grace. Here's what Luther said about the same phrase. He said, this spring of grace, this grace upon grace, is inexhaustible. It never loses anything, no matter how much we draw, but remains an infinite fountain. I love that picture. That's just beautiful. That Jesus came just overflowing with this infinite fountain of grace. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, though. It was grace and truth, right? Don't we have to be people of truth? Isn't it important that we're sharing not grace with people, but truth with people, too? And interestingly, the Lutheran commentary writer, the one that every Lutheran pastor has on their shelf somewhere, is a guy named Lenski. And in his commentary, he says this about the word truth in verse 14. He says, truth is the saving light which John has mentioned repeatedly. While the term is general, it is constantly used, as here joined with grace, to denote the saving realities in God in Christ Jesus. In other words, what he's saying is when Jesus came full of grace and truth, the truth was not the truth about our sin or our actions. The truth was the truth about Jesus and the grace that he came with for us. That's what he's talking about. That's what Jesus was full of when he came to us, the saving realities in God in Christ Jesus. So how did Jesus literally put that grace upon grace into practice in his life? Well, in Luke 15, it tells us this. It says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. So the number one complaint that the religious leaders of the day had about Jesus was about the kind of people he hung around with. Now, I want to come back to that phrase in a minute, but first of all, I want to make sure we understand something. I'm not connecting LGBTQ people and tax collectors and sinners, okay? I'm not drawing parallels there based on who they were and what they did. I'm drawing parallels there based on how the church treated them. Okay? There's an author whose book I just found recently. Her name is Brenna Blaine, and her book's not on my list of recommended titles yet because I haven't finished reading it yet, and I won't recommend a book I haven't read yet. But I'm guessing it's going to end up on that list from what I've read so far. But she's an author and she's a youth minister. She's a lesbian. She remembers growing up, she grew up in a pretty fundamental Baptist church context. And she remembers when she finally realized that she was gay and that wasn't going to change, no matter how desperately she was praying that it would change in her life. She remembers thinking, well, that's it. I'm just going to go to hell. And I might as well try to have fun in life before I have to spend eternity separated from God in hell. That's what she believed her future was. And she also says, I saw her on a podcast recently, and she said she remembers vividly having a conversation with her best friend in the church. And the two of them were looking at each other, and her best friend looked at her and said, this just sucks that you're just going to go to hell. I mean, her best friend wasn't being judgmental. She wasn't condemning. She was just simply saying, I hate that you can't do anything about that you're just going to go to hell and there's nothing you can do about it. That's what they believed, at least, their church was teaching, right? But anyway, the reason I tell you about Brenna is because she has a word for the tax collectors and sinners here. She says they were taboo people. And I love that. That's a great way to say it. To the religious leaders of the day, they were taboo people. They were people that were not welcome in the temple. And by the way, they were people that there was nothing they could do to ever make themselves welcome in the temple, right? They were unclean. And the religious leaders would not only not interact with them, they wouldn't enter their homes. They wouldn't share a meal with them because that would make them unclean too. They were taboo people. So I love it. She says it this way in her book. She says, we can learn a lot about Jesus based on how he treated taboo people. How did he treat taboo people? They loved being around him. He hung out with them. He welcomed them. By the way, that's another way of translating that word welcomed is accepted. He accepted them. And he had table fellowship with them. I don't know if you've ever been to the Middle East. Every single home you enter, you have to eat something, right? They will welcome you into the room. They will put food in front of you. Even if you're there because you have to have a difficult conversation and you're kind of enemies, no, you got to share food together, right? The first time I went to Israel, I was with a group of 10 pastors, and we were visiting all these different ministries that our churches were thinking about supporting. And we were warned, we're like, don't eat too much at meals because every place you go, you're going to have to eat food. And if you don't eat food, it's a huge insult, right? Table fellowship is a big deal, right? And so when they said, not only does Jesus accept these people, these taboo people, but he eats with them. The Pharisees were stunned because you wouldn't expect Jesus to hang out with these taboo people. And I would argue that in many contexts, many churches, many Christians treat LGBTQ people these days as if they are taboo people. And they're the very people that Jesus hung around with. Let me give you one example of that. In Luke chapter 19, Jesus is heading to Jerusalem. Do you know why he's heading to Jerusalem? He's going to die on the cross, right? He's got that figured out. He knows this is the last trip he's making to Jerusalem before he's going to be crucified. So you would think if there was ever a time where Jesus would kind of be in his own head, sometimes when Betty comes with me, when we come out here for church on a Sunday morning, we got about a 45-minute drive on Sunday morning. It's dead silent in the car, and she knows not to talk to me because I'm kind of in my own head, not because I'm coming to be crucified, but because I got a sermon in my head, right, that I haven't preached yet, and I'm going through the sermon in my head. I'm kind of in my own head. So you would think if there was ever a time when Jesus was going to be in his own head, it'd be on that final trip to Jerusalem. He's he's got to face the religious leaders. He knows he's going to go through this horrible beating and death, but he's not. In fact, he's focused relentlessly on the others around him. Surprise, surprise, right? Full of grace and truth, full of grace upon grace. So he comes into Jericho, which was not that far from Jerusalem, and the word goes out that he's coming, and so as you remember, the people line the streets to see Jesus, right? I imagine the religious leaders had rooms ready for Jesus to come and have a meal and stay with them. They were just hoping this popular rabbi would come and stay at their place, right? And so Jesus comes walking through town, and there's this guy named Zacchaeus. You've all heard the story. Let's sing. Zacchaeus was a wheat. No, we're not going to sing that. Sorry. No. But yeah, right. But so Zacchaeus is this short guy, and he's a tax collector. So he's one of those taboo people. And he's the last person in the world the religious leaders expect Jesus to want to have anything to do with. And Zacchaeus can't see Jesus, so he climbs up this tree, remember, so he can at least get a glimpse. He is so interested from the stories he's heard about how Jesus treats taboo people that he just wants to get a glimpse of this guy. Isn't that amazing? And so here's Zacchaeus. And Jesus comes by, and it says when Jesus reached the spot where Zacchaeus is up in the tree, he says to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Now, by the way, I've highlighted the word must there because the word there is not the normal word for have to. It's the word for a divine appointment. In other words, Jesus is saying to Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus, my heavenly Father has ordained that I would stay in your house today. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? And so Zacchaeus came down and welcomed him gladly. And of course, what did the people say? He's going to hang out with one of those taboo people. What's he doing? Why would he do that? Why is he not hanging out with me? Why is he hanging out with these taboo people? Now, by the way, we're told a few verses later that Jesus said to Zacchaeus, before I enter your house, I want to make sure you understand my views on the Roman occupation with which you're working, and I want to make sure. No, that's not in the gospel. Jesus didn't say anything like that. He didn't say to Zacchaeus, look, Zacchaeus, I must stay at your house today, but you got to know I'm not real thrilled with how you're spending your life. Or I've got issues with how you're making a living. Or you know that you're a taboo person, don't you? And there's a reason why you're a taboo person. And he doesn't say any of that. He just says, I got to come to your house. Isn't that cool? I would argue this, that most churches, not just many, I would argue the vast majority of churches are believe, behave, belong. You need to believe certain things, and if you believe those certain things, you need to behave in a certain way. And if you believe the same things we believe and behave in the same way that we've deemed it's important for you to behave, by the way, we may not always behave that way ourselves, but that's not important. We can hide it well. Then you can belong. And by belong, I don't mean church membership. I mean, you can be part of the church family. Right? You can be one of us. You can be here, right? I would argue that Jesus did it very differently than that. I would argue that Jesus started with belong. The reason Zacchaeus wanted to get a glimpse of Jesus is he had heard from other taboo people, you can hang with Jesus. He loves people like us. By the way, I think one of the things I got most in trouble for saying in church on a Sunday morning was the Sunday after that horrible massacre in the gay disco down in Orlando. The next morning, we were going to pray for that. And I've already told you guys, I don't think I'm the best prayer in the world during services, especially when I'm just kind of making something up at the time, you know. I'm not real fluent, and like some of my friends who were pastors are. But it was time to pray for the people that had been killed in that horrible massacre. And I said we were going to pray. And then I said this. I said, you know, I don't know. It just seems to me that if Jesus were around today, that's exactly the kind of place Jesus would have been in. That got me in a lot of trouble with people. But I think it's true. And I stand by it. because people in that place would have felt like they belonged with Jesus. Jesus starts with belong. Then he works on what we believe. And then finally, I would argue he doesn't even really worry about how we behave. That's not his deal. He's more concerned with our becoming. The new creature that we are becoming. The measuring up to Jesus, like we talked about in the sermon last Sunday, person that we are becoming. That's what he's concerned about. But he definitely starts with belong. So I think it's pretty clear what Jesus would do. I think if Jesus had been sitting in that room with Matt when he went to go see his pastor, and Jesus was there, Jesus would that whole outcome of that conversation would have been very, very different. And I definitely think if Jesus had been hanging around on Sunday morning, when Matt's family went up to go to communion, Jesus would have gone over and sat next to Matt. Said, I'm with you here, buddy. You don't need my body and blood, you got me. Yeah. But here's the second question I really think we do have to think about a little bit. And that's this: where are we finding our primary source of identity? And how can we help the LGBTQ people in our lives answer that question as well? Now, I've talked with you guys a little bit about this before. I think I did it in a sermon not that long ago, but let me just give you just a quick review. There's these things called primary and secondary sources of identity in our lives. Our primary source of identity is our relationship with God. That comes first, right? I am first and foremost a child of God. Then I have these secondary sources of identity. I am Betty's husband. I am a golfer, and a few weeks ago I shot one of the worst rounds of my life, and it affected me much more than it should have for a secondary source of identity, right? I'm the guy that does this fully known and truly loved ministry around our synod now. In fact, I had a guy the other day say to me, oh, you're that gay pastor guy, right? I went, well, I'd probably say it a little differently than that, but yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, I'm the guy that talks about this issue around our synod, right? But those are secondary sources of identity. And if I ever let them, any one of them, become my primary source of identity, what I've basically done is I basically replaced God with one of my secondary sources of identity. And I first read about this in a book by a theologian in the Missouri Synod called Robert Kolb. And Kolb is brilliant. He says it this way. He says, my wife is a wonderful gift from God. She is a secondary source of my identity. I am her husband. But if I make her my primary source of identity, I turn her into a God, and I put both her and me in a prison. And this is the way he put it. He goes, as a wife, she has many redeeming qualities. As a God, she leaves a lot to be desired. And I love that. But what he's saying is, if we let anything else be our primary source of identity, we are going to get let down, right? We are going to get to the point where they let us down because they're not God, and we let them down, right? And so here's why I bring this up. From the many conversations I've had with LGBTQ people, what they hear a lot from the LGBTQ community is that your primary source of identity is being gay or trans. It's in your sexuality or your gender. That's your primary source of identity. Now, I've even talked with a guy once who told me that when he told one of his friends that he was going to go to church, the guy said, well, you can be a Christian if you want, but don't forget who you really are, right? And so I think our challenge as we are in relationship with gay and trans people is to help them do what we would do with anyone else in our life, hopefully, and that is help them put their primary source of identity in Jesus. And I'm convinced that if that's true, I'm not worried about anything else. Everything else is going to sort itself out, right? So with that in mind, we're going to take a break in just a second. But where does this idea, this ministry I'm doing called Fully Known and Truly Loved, where does that come from? Well, it comes from a quote from Tim Keller, who I told you about before. It's actually in his book on the meaning of marriage. And he says this, he says, to be loved but not known is comforting but superficial. Let me stop there for a minute. If you tell me you love me, but you don't really know me, well, that's comforting. But, it's pretty superficial, right? I go and I speak at churches, and I basically do everything I just did with you guys. Now, you guys do know me a little more. They don't know me. I'm just some guy that their pastor wanted to come in to talk about something he didn't have the guts to talk about in front of his congregation, right? But I'll have people come up to me after and go, "Oh, Mark, I love you. You're awesome." And then I'm going, if you really got to know me, you might not feel that way, right? Right? And so it's comforting, but it's superficial, right? He goes on. He says, to be known and not loved, that's our greatest fear, right? My greatest fear is that somebody's going to get to know me, and the more they get to know me, the more they're going to go, "Whoa, dude, I really don't want anything to do with you," right? You're not the kind of person I like to hang around with. That's our greatest fear. But to be fully known, Keller says, and truly loved is, a lot like being loved by God. First of all, God knows everything there is to know about you, right? The Bible says he knows how many hairs are on your head right now. And that's a bigger challenge with some of us than others, right? But God knows every single thing you've ever thought, every single thing you've ever done. He knows stuff about you that you don't even admit to yourself. And he still loves you. You are fully known and truly loved by God. And that's what we need most of all. Our churches should be places where people can be fully known with all their baggage, whatever that is. They shouldn't have to hide anything about themselves. Be fully known and know that they are truly loved. A number of years ago at Trinity, because of my history with my brother, which, by the way, early in our relationship was not so good. I'm afraid he heard a lot of legalism from me, and I said a lot of things that I regret and wish I could take back. But now we are incredibly close. I love my brother Paul. I love his husband Jim. I don't know where our family would be without them, right? But I learned a lot over the years, a lot about myself and about how I was putting my theology into practice and where I was lacking in that. And so because I've been very open about that over the years, our church has been a place at Trinity where we talked about issues like this a lot more than I think other churches do. And one particular Lent, on Wednesday nights, we were handling some really tough topics. And on this particular Wednesday night, we were talking about the transgender issue. And theologically, we were saying, what do we think the Bible has to say about this? And what are transgender people facing that is a struggle for them, and how can we show love and grace? We were talking about all these things, and at the very end, I said something like this. I said, I think there's still a lot we don't know, and that we need to talk about more on this issue. I said, but I can tell you this: Trinity will always be a place where trans people are welcome. And the way we were doing the services in midweek, the sermon was the last thing. So you finished the sermon, there was 3 verses of a hymn, and we were done, right? And so as we're finishing up the hymn, and I'm starting to head to the back to take my robe off, I see an elderly gentleman from our congregation who, by the way, has sometimes over the years had some critical things to say about me and our ministry. I see him making a beeline for me. And I'm like, uh-oh, here we go, right? And so I walk into the sacristy, and the hook is on the wall here, and the door's back there, so I can hear him coming. And I'm like, maybe if I just pretend he's not there, he'll go away, right? And I take my robe off, and I hang it up, and I hear the door shut, and it's pretty abrupt. And I'm like, okay. And I turn around, and instead of anger, he's got tears in his eyes. And he says to me, Pastor Mark, you were talking about me tonight. And I looked at him and I said, I don't understand. And he said, all my life, this guy's in his 70s at this point. All my life I've known I was a woman trapped in a man's body. And I've never told a single other person but you now. And he goes, growing up, in the America I grew up in, you didn't tell people stuff like that. And you didn't act on stuff like that. And it's been a struggle for me all my life. And then he said this, and I've told this story 100 times, and I still get choked up. He said, for 31 years, I've walked into this church on Sunday morning, and every single week, there's a voice in the back of my head going, if they only knew, you would not be welcome here. He said, now I know that you know, and I'm still welcome here. And he just gave me a big hug. Folks, that's what our churches ought to be like. They ought to be places where 70-some-year-old men who've struggled with their gender their whole life can be open about it. Now, by the way, I wish I could tell you, I had his permission to tell you who he is and that we had him speak the next Wednesday on that night, but he's not at that point, right? It's still a big secret because he doesn't know how he'd be able to share that with people. So I'm not saying Trinity's a perfect church or anything like that. But that's what our churches ought to be like. They ought to be places where people know that they can be totally open about who they are. They can be fully known, and they will be truly loved because that's the way God loves them. So what can you specifically do with the people that you know who are gay or trans? I would say, first of all, just be there for people. You know, when you go back and you read the book of Job, Job is going through some pretty tough stuff in his life. And by the way, I don't know a gay or trans person that grew up in the church that didn't have some tough stuff to go through in their lives. And when his friends show up, once they start talking, they mess it up terribly. But you remember what they do first? They just sit with him. They're just there with him. And that's awesome, right? I can't tell you how many times I've heard over and over and over again from gay or trans people that when they came out, their circle of friends shrunk dramatically. And it wasn't because people were judging them necessarily. It's just that they felt uncomfortable or they didn't know what to say. So, first of all, I can just tell you, just be there for people. Second of all, listen to their stories. When in that study I told you before, 96% of people when they came out, had left their church growing up. He asked them why. He gave them a list of about 30 possible things to answer. Do you know what the number one was? No one would listen to my story. That was number one. It wasn't, I didn't like the theology of the church. It wasn't, the pastor wouldn't let me teach Sunday school anymore. It was, no one would listen to my story. That's why they left. I heard this great question once, and I use it with people. I'll say something like that. I feel like your life's a book and I'm coming in at chapter 12. Get me caught up, right? And just listen to their story. Third, I would encourage you to read more about this subject. Watch videos. If you search for some of the authors, if you're saying, well, I'm not reading books, that's fine. If you search in YouTube for some of the authors, there's some great opportunities to hear what they have to say and probably get, 90% of their book in a 20-minute video, right? Be willing to talk about this with people and share what you're feeling. And finally, I just say, don't be afraid. One last quick story. There was a guy from our church at Trinity who, he's gay, he's married. When he first started coming to our church, his husband wouldn't come to church. Now his husband not only comes to church, but he plays in the brass ensemble. And his mom had passed away, and he had gotten to know the pastor at his mom's church, and the pastor knew a little bit about his story. And so one Sunday after his mom had died, he and his sister decided to go back to mom's church for church. And the pastor saw them in the lobby before the service, talked with them for a little bit, and then when it came time for communion, he came up for communion, and the pastor said loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, I can't commune you because of your lifestyle. He was devastated. And he left, and he called me, and I told him, that was horrible. He never should have done that to you. And I got off the phone with my friend, and I called the pastor. And I said, look, first of all, I want you to understand something. I'm not telling you who you should give communion to at your church. That's your job to make that decision in that place. I'm not trying to judge you on that. My question is, why didn't you just ask him before the service? You knew he was there. You knew he was going to come up for communion. Why didn't you just ask him not to come up for communion? And you know what he said to me? He said, you're right. I should have done that. I was afraid of how that conversation would go. And I said, well, think about that for a minute. Now, this is a pretty young pastor, and I might have been a little brusque with him. I think I told him to put on his big boy pants and have hard conversations. But just think about that. I mean, it was just fear, right? And it put him in a position where he felt like he was trapped. You know, instead of just not being afraid. And I know this friend of mine, he wouldn't have been thrilled with that, but he would have said, okay, I understand. And it wouldn't have been a big deal, right? And instead, he embarrassed him in front of the whole church, right? Just don't be afraid. So, all right, we're going to take can we take like a 10-minute break? And then, like I said, we're going to talk through a few principles and then have some discussion together, okay? So let's come back in about 10 minutes, okay? We do. Awesome. Thank you. So go get snacks.